One question Christian apologists often ask skeptics and atheists is this: how can you ground reason and logic? For them, God is the source of reason and logic, so if someone does not believe in God, then reason and logic must become subjective and therefore utterly unreliable. The argument usually goes something like this: if we do not bring God into the picture, atheists can only say that their ability to reason came from evolution. But evolution involves random mutation, so how can a reasoning system produced by that unguided process be trustworthy? That is a fair question. In this video, I want to lay out why I use reason and logic without feeling the need to ground them in God. I hope you will stay until the end because you might have questions or objections as you watch, but some of those objections will be addressed later in the video, where I go through common Christian pushbacks and respond to them. Some of my explanations here are not ones I have heard often from others, so there might be something new for you to think about. Before I get into my explanation, I want to make two disclaimers. First, this video is about how I ground reason and logic. I am not speaking for all atheists. I do not represent every atheist, and I am not claiming this is the official atheist answer. However, I do think that, in practice, people ground reason and logic in a similar way, whether they are theists or atheists. That might sound strange at first, but bear with me. This point will become clearer as the video goes on. Second, while I do believe in evolution, my argument in this video does not depend on evolution being true. You can believe in young earth creationism. You can believe that God specially created human beings. You can believe that humans do not share ancestry with chimpanzees. Even then, my explanation of how I ground reason and logic would not inherently contradict that worldview, because I'm not saying I ground reason and logic in evolution. Sure, I believe that evolution is true, but that is not the reason why I trust my reason and laws of logic. Hello my friends, this is Shen from Mindful Living. Welcome to the channel. On this channel, we learn how to think and evaluate claims. You might think this channel is mainly about debunking religion, but my primary goal is to promote careful thinking and to help us reduce our personal biases as much as possible. I am not against religion itself, but I hope you can agree that whether we are religious or not, it is important to make good rational judgment. If this is something you are interested in, please subscribe so you don't miss future videos. Alright, let's dive in. Let me cut to the chase from the start. I ground reason and logic in my experience and my interaction with the world. Before I explain what I mean, let me define two terms, reason and logic. For me, reason is a function of the brain. My brain engages in reasoning. Everyone does this at different levels. Maybe your brain is better at it than mine. Reason is reliable to me because it works in my experience. Not perfectly, but well enough to help me understand things, solve problems, avoid mistakes, and reach my goals. That does not mean my reasoning is infallible. It just means I have good practical reasons to trust it, while also checking it, correcting it, and improving it. Logic, on the other hand, is not a physical object sitting somewhere in the universe. It is not like a rock, a tree, or a molecule. Logic is an abstract system we use to evaluate whether conclusions follow from premises. It helps us organize thought, detect contradictions, and communicate clearly. I do not need to believe that logic is some magical independent object floating outside the universe in order to use it. I also do not need to reduce logic to a material object. Logic is an abstract tool used by thinking minds. But that does not mean logic is arbitrary or merely subjective. Logic concerns identity, distinction, consistency, and relationships. These are not invented out of nothing. They arise from our engagement with reality. For example, the law of identity only has content because there's something to identify. The law of non-contradiction only has content because there are claims, properties, and distinctions we can compare. If nothing existed, there would be nothing to identify, nothing to distinguish, and nothing to make claims about. Again, when I say I ground logic in reality, I do not mean logic is a physical substance. I mean logic is meaningful because reality has things, distinctions, patterns, and relationships that thinking minds can recognize. And because reality appears stable in our experience, we have no reason to think the basic laws of logic randomly change from moment to moment. In every case we observe, A is A. A thing is itself. A claim cannot be both true and false in the same sense at the same time. So the universality of logic, at least as we encounter and use it, is grounded in a stable structure of reality. I do not need to imagine an unchanging God behind it in order to use logic or trust it. Now, there is an important distinction here. It is one thing to ask, what is logic about? It is another thing to ask, how do I know I can use logic reliably? My answer to the first question is reality, as I explained just now. My answer to the second question is experience. I know I can use reason and logic because I have tested them constantly in my interaction with the world. I use them to solve problems, make predictions, avoid contradictions, build things, understand people, and correct mistakes. And I think this is actually how most people come to trust their reasoning ability, whether they are atheists or Christians. Because even if you believe God created the human mind, that does not automatically mean your reasoning is reliable in every case. Christians do not believe they always think perfectly just because God created them. They know they can make mistakes. They know they can misunderstand things. They know they can fail tests, make bad decisions, misread situations, and come to wrong conclusions. In fact, Christians usually believe non-Christians are making a serious intellectual and spiritual mistake by rejecting God. So even in their worldview, human minds can be wrong. And how do they know human minds can be wrong? Through experience. They observe mistakes, they compare beliefs with reality, they test ideas, they revise conclusions, they learn through failure. Imagine the world's smartest engineers trying to build a reusable rocket. They do not simply say, God created our minds, therefore this rocket design must work. They test it, it may fail. They adjust, they test again. Eventually they may succeed. And even after they succeed, future launches can still fail. That is how reasoning works in real life. This is true whether evolution is true or creationism is true. In practice, we trust reason because it proves useful, and we correct reason when it fails. I think everyone can agree that our minds are not perfect. They are prone to cognitive biases, faulty assumptions, emotional pressure, and many other errors. And honestly, that is exactly what I would expect if our minds are products of evolution. I believe my brain evolved, but that does not mean I blindly trust every judgment my mind makes. I know my mind has limits. For example, I am a statistician. My math may be better than the average person, but that does not mean I always score 100% on math or statistics tests. And when it comes to quantum physics or advanced calculus, that is completely out of my league. I have no idea how some of that math works, because to be a statistician, you do not need to master every branch of mathematics. And that would not suddenly change if I become a Christian tomorrow. If I decided today that God grounds reason, logic, and mathematics, I would not suddenly get 100% on every advanced calculus test. I would not instantly be able to have a technical conversation with a quantum physicist. Believing that God is the God of math does not magically turn someone into a math genius. Christians know this too. They may say reason and logic are grounded in God, but they still know their own minds have limits. If they are bad at math, believing God does not make them good at math. If they are bad at biology, believing in God does not make them good at biology. They learn what they are good at and what they are not good at through experience, practice, feedback, and correction, just like the rest of us. And this applies not only to knowledge, but also to mental ability itself. As I get older, I expect that my mental faculties may decline. Maybe one day I will not be able to perform the kind of statistical analysis I can do now. And if that happens, I would not say, well, I believe evolution is true, so my mind cannot fail. That would make no sense. Our minds can work well in some areas, poorly in others, and worse over time. We do not discover those limits by appealing to evolution or to God. We discover them through experience. The way I know my mind is working reasonably well right now is through experience. And the way I would know my mind is failing is also through experience. I compare my thoughts with reality. I notice mistakes. I rely on feedback, testing, correction, and sometimes the judgment of other people. That is how we evaluate our reasoning in real life. Now, some Christians may say, fine, we learn through trial and error, but atoms do not think, atoms do not reason, atoms do not know truth, and since a cause cannot generate what it does not possess, therefore reasoning cannot come from a material brain. But I do not find that convincing, because complex systems often have properties that their individual parts do not have by themselves. We call these emergent properties. Hydrogen atoms are not wet. Oxygen atoms are not wet. But when hydrogen and oxygen combine in a wet structure and exist in large quantities, we get water, and we describe water as wet. We do not need to imagine a separate metaphysical essence called wetness floating somewhere inside or outside the universe. If someone wants to believe that, fine, but there is no compelling reason to think we must believe that in order to explain wetness. The same point applies to more complicated things like living organisms. Atoms do not digest food, but when atoms are organized into cells, tissues, organs, and biological systems, digestion happens. When I drink milk, my body can break it down. Calcium can be used for bones, fats can be burned or stored, protein can be broken down into amino acids and used to repair and build muscle tissue. That is an incredibly complex process. In a loose sense, the body is tracking reality. It is responding to chemical structures and directing materials in useful ways. And all of this happens without my conscious mind needing to supervise every step. But I rarely hear Christians say, atoms do not digest, therefore digestion must come directly from God. Without God, how can atheists trust their stomachs? They do not usually say, atoms do not circulate blood, therefore the circulatory system cannot be physical. They do not usually say, atoms do not transmit nerve signals, therefore the nervous system cannot come from matter. But when it comes to the brain, suddenly they say, atoms do not reason, therefore reason cannot come from the physical world, but from God. I think that is special pleading. The brain is an organ. It is more complex than the stomach, but it is still part of the body. If Christians are willing to accept that digestion, circulation, reproduction, and the nervous system can emerge from organized biological systems, then they need a special argument for why reasoning cannot emerge from the brain. Simply saying atoms do not think is not enough. Atoms do not digest either, but stomachs do. Atoms do not pump blood, but hearts do. Atoms do not reason by themselves, but brains can. The bottom line is this: I'm a thinking creature living in a structured world. I use reason and logic because they work. I trust them because they have been tested through experience. And when they fail, I correct them through further interaction with reality. That is not a perfect foundation, but I do not think Christians have a perfect foundation either. Saying God created my mind does not remove human error. It does not make your reasoning automatically reliable. And in practice, Christians also test their reasoning by experience, correction, and interaction with the world. That is why I think both atheists and Christians, at the practical level, come to trust reason in much the same way. They use it, they test it, they see it work, they see it fail, they correct it, and they keep using it because there's no other way to think carefully about anything. They do not get the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and the law of excluded middle from the Bible. They do not learn them by direct revelation from God. They learn them from everyday experience. Even if God exists, and even if these laws exist in God's mind, that does not change how we come to know them. We learn them by interacting with reality. whether reality tracks some metaphysical laws or whether those laws describe reality's own inherent structure, we still ground our use of reason and logic in this world. Some Christians, not many, but some, might object by asking how I can trust my own experience to tell me whether my reason works. They may say perception itself is unreliable unless we first believe in God. I think the weakness of this objection is easy to see. Nobody first believes in God before they trust their senses. When a baby is not yet mentally capable of believing in God, the baby is already learning through sight, sound, touch, taste, and pain. Before we are consciously religious, we are already relying on our senses to interact with the world. I do not see how anyone can seriously object to this. Of course, our senses can fail, just like our reason. We can misperceive things. Our brains can misread signals. We can be tricked by illusions, dreams, or hallucinations. But that does not mean perception is useless. It means perception needs to be checked. And we do this all the time. If I see something that looks real, but nobody else can see it, I have a reason to question my perception. If I hear a voice, but there is no source and other people do not hear it, I have a reason to ask whether my brain is producing the experience. Or imagine someone loses a limb in an accident. Months later, they may still feel pain in that missing limb, but they do not conclude, my limb must still be there because I feel pain. They can look. They can touch the area with the other hand. Doctors can examine it. Other people can confirm it. After that, we can reasonably conclude that the pain is phantom pain, and biology can explain why the experience feels real even though the limb is gone. That is the point. We know perception is not perfect, but we have ways to cross-check perception. We compare one sense with another. We compare our perception with other people's perception. We test. We repeat, we look for consistency, and when something unusual happens, we are naturally cautious before jumping to conclusions. We ask whether we are really perceiving something in the external world or whether our brain is misfiring. This is not controversial. Christians also believe hallucinations, delusions, illusions, and mental confusion are possible, and Christians also use the same kind of cross-checking to make sure they are not being deceived by their own minds. So when all our senses are pointing in the same direction, when other people can verify the same thing, and when repeated experience continues to confirm it, we treat that as a good reason to trust our perception, not with absolute certainty, but with reasonable confidence. If a Christian still insists that I cannot trust my senses at all unless I first believe in God, then they should ask whether they actually live by that standard themselves. Did they trust their senses before they believe in God? Did they learn from experience before they read the Bible? Did they rely on sight, sound, touch, and memory before they developed a theology of perception? Of course they did. So once again, being a Christian does not escape the problem. In real life, they also trust perception through experience, testing, correction, and cross-verification. They may add God behind the process, but they still learn to trust the process the same way everyone else does. When presuppositional apologists are asked how they know their God grounds reason and logic, they often answer by saying God revealed himself through the Bible or through the Holy Spirit. But both answers already require perception. If you say you came to know God through the Bible, you had to trust your eyes, your reading ability, your memory, and your reasoning before reaching that conclusion. If you say you came to know God through the experience of the Holy Spirit, you still had to trust your own inner experience before concluding that the experience came from God. In other words, you cannot use the Bible or personal religious experience to prove that your senses are reliable unless you are already trusting your senses to interpret the Bible or that experience. If the apologists respond by saying, we presuppose God first, and this is why we can trust our senses, then I would simply call that circular reasoning. And here's where something interesting happens. Presuppositional apologists often say circular reasoning is acceptable at the foundational level. I find that ironic. They insist that the laws of logic are unchanging and universal because they are grounded in God, but then they turn around and say, by the way, circular reasoning is not always wrong. That is convenient. I personally do not think circular reasoning becomes valid just because you place it at the foundation of your worldview. But I'm not going to spend too much time on that here. I just want to point out a more immediate problem. If they tell me that without believing in God, I cannot trust my senses, perceptions, and reasoning, then how do they expect me to be convinced by their argument? If I cannot trust my senses, then maybe I'm wrong that I'm even hearing their words. Maybe I'm wrong that I'm seeing them. Maybe their voice is an illusion. Maybe their existence is a hallucination. Maybe it's all in my head. But of course, they do not want me to go there. They expect me to listen to them. They expect me to understand their words. They expect me to evaluate their arguments. They expect me to take their speech seriously. In other words, they are relying on my senses while telling me I have no right to rely on my senses. Do you see the irony? They say if humans are products of evolution, then you cannot trust your brain to track truth. Okay, suppose I accept that for a moment. Suppose I become radically skeptical of my brain, my senses, my hearing, my memory, and my ability to understand the language. Would that help their argument? Would that convince me that their God exists? Of course not. Because now I also have no reason to trust that I'm hearing them correctly. I have no reason to trust that their argument exists. I have no reason to trust that the Bible I'm reading is really there. I have no reason to trust that the experience they call the Holy Spirit is actually from God. Their argument destroys the very bridge they need to cross in order to persuade me. That is why this objection is self-defeating. They want me to distrust my perception in theory, but they need me to trust my perception in practice. They want to say my senses are unreliable without God, while expecting me to rely on those same senses to hear, understand, and respond to their argument before I profess belief in God. My point is simple. Any attempt to make me distrust perception in a total sense is pointless. It does not help the Christian case. It just undermines communication itself. I trust my senses with caution and cross-checking, and the apologist expects me to trust my senses too. Otherwise, there's no conversation to be had. And just to be clear, I am not using the same sense to prove the same sense works. I'm not using vision alone to prove that vision works. I'm saying we use different senses, along with memory, repeated experience, and other people's confirmation to cross-check our perceptions. That is not circular reasoning. That is fault-checking. And at no point am I saying our senses are completely reliable. I fully accept that one or more of my senses can misfire. When that happens, other senses may help detect that problem. I also accept the possibility that all my senses could fail at the same time. But since my senses are the only input system I have for interacting with the world, I can only work with the mental model they provide. For example, I know that color is not a property sitting inside objects exactly the way I experience it. My brain takes wavelengths of light and turns them into the experience of color. So the picture that forms in my mind is not identical to reality itself, but it is good enough for me to navigate the world. That is the point. My perception does not need to give me perfect access to reality in order to be useful. It only needs to track reality well enough for practical correction, prediction, communication, and survival. It is not about certainty, but different degrees of probability, reliability, and cross-checking. I trust my senses and reasoning provisionally because they consistently help me interact with the world. And honestly, I do not think this should be controversial. I feel like I'm explaining something very basic here. In closing, I think this whole objection that atheists can't trust their reason unless they ground it in God only works if you demand a level of certainty from atheists that nobody actually has and nobody actually uses. We do not need absolute certainty to reason. We do not need absolute certainty to trust our senses. We do not need absolute certainty to learn from experience. What we need is reasonable confidence, repeated testing, correction, and the humility to admit when we are wrong. And Christians rely on the same process. They use reason before they defend God. They trust their senses before they read the Bible. They learn from experience before they build a theology of reality. So if someone wants to say, unless you can be absolutely certain, you cannot make sense of anything, and you can only be absolutely certain if you believe in God, my response is simple. You do not live that way either. And if your objection depends on a standard you do not apply to yourself, then it is not a serious objection. It is just a debating tactic. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. You already made it to the end, so you might as well do it, right? Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.